If you were to guess that we'll be in Mark 14 and 15, that would be a good guess. Since that was what we heard read this morning. This may be a strange message. I feel like I'm going to get awkwardly political this morning because I don't know how to preach this passage any other way. I don't know how to engage this passage and interpret it for us in this place, in this time, without speaking to our idols. So before I do that, let's talk about comic books. So imagine the scene. Bruce Banner is tied up. So far, he's managed to keep his rage under control. If you know who Bruce Banner is, you know what comes when he rages. But his enemies haven't really pushed him to the point to his limits yet, until they start to anger him and provoke him and torture him. And all of a sudden, his anger turns to rage, and his rage causes him to Hulk, because that's who he is. And he bursts free of his bonds, and Banner, now the Hulk, destroys his captors and breaks free from his prison to join back up with the Avengers to save the world. Or how about this scene? A timer begins to count down. 30, 29, 28. And strapped to that timer is a bomb, and the bomb is strapped to his chest. But who is he? Does it matter? It could be James Bond. It could be Ant-Man. It could be John McClane or Katniss Everdeen. It could be literally anyone for that matter. 19, 18, 17. This moment is in just about every action movie we've ever loved. The bad guys have captured the good guy. And 9, 8, 7. The good guy faces impossible odds as the seconds tick away, and debating between two wires, he goes to cut one and then switches to the other two. 1. Oh, so close, right? We don't have any problem seeing our heroes in chains. We don't even have a problem seeing our heroes take a good beating. In fact, the worse the beating, the more impressed we usually are when the hero, against all odds and with almost nothing left, wins out in the end. But when we watch our action heroes fight, there is always this confident sense that we know how the story ends. Our hero will not die. But man, these directors are good at building suspense and making me believe till that last moment that the hero is in real trouble. Yet, in those final seconds, when all hope seems lost, the hero overcomes, the hero breaks free, the hero defeats his enemies. And if you've ever been in a crowded movie theater, at the end of a movie like this, the director did an amazing job. You can hear the audience sort of break into an applause, and there's excitement and energy. But the hero has to win, because we as a people cannot accept a story where the hero loses. Heroes do not die at the hands of their enemies. That's not the way that we learned to tell the story. Good guys win, bad guys lose. This is the story that our culture has told us from our earliest cartoon watching days. Listen to the way one candidate for his party's nomination frames America's current place in the world. We don't win anymore, he says. Now we're losing to everyone. We lose to China, we lose to Mexico. If this candidate has anything of substance to say, we haven't heard it yet because he's so busy tapping into our imaginations. Good guys win and bad guys lose, and we have been losing. He is someone who gets us, who understands our dreams. He had us at win. A journalist thought to run some of his speeches through an online assessment tool that tells you what grade level you're writing at or you're speaking at. And for his prepared speeches, his language, his vocabulary, his sentence structure is all at a 3rd grade level, significantly lower than the majority of the other candidates in his party. But when he speaks off the cuff, extemporaneously, when he comes off of his prepared notes, he gets bumped up a couple grade levels because his speeches are being written at a level that he cannot maintain naturally, because he's doing this on purpose. because he's tapping into our childhoods. He's drawing on the categories of childhood, categories that shaped our imaginations into adulthood and have solidified. He's taking us back to recess where there are winners and there are losers. He calls his enemies names. He stands up to the bullies and he rallies us around the promise of being winners again. In the story that we know so well, good guys win because they are stronger and they can Hulk themselves out of danger. Or they are smarter and they pull a MacGyver and escape certain death. Which is why, if we are honest, if we read Scripture honestly, we understand the cries of the crowds who, passing by Jesus, shake their heads and say, "Save yourself! Come down from the cross!" Or we hear the chief priests and the scribes mock him. He saved others, cannot save himself. And if we're honest, we think, yeah, that's right. Having just read through the Gospel of Mark, we have heard all of the things that Jesus could do and did do. Casting out unclean spirits, healing lepers, raising the dead, even controlling the wind and the waves. All of this power and this strength, all of this insight and wisdom. And there Jesus hangs on the cross, frail, flesh torn and tattered, his body bloodied and battered, onlookers mocking him. Heck, even the criminals on crosses on his sides revile him. This is sheer weakness. This is humiliation. This is not the power of God on display. This is pitiful and embarrassing. And the chief priests and the scribes, they say so. In verse 32, we hear them say, "Let this so-called Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from that cross. Then we'll see it with our own eyes, and then we will believe." If Jesus wins on their terms, if God rescues him from the cross, if something dramatic and powerful happens, then they will have reason to believe that Jesus is the anointed one of God. Then they will believe. Or so they say. But the cross is a litmus test for those who would claim to be interested in Jesus. It's easy to follow a crowd. It's easy to follow polls and public opinion. It's easy to follow a showman who puts on a good show, and to follow a miracle worker who does amazing things that you can't explain. It's easy to follow a guy with serious power. It's easy to follow a guy with an unrivaled army behind him. But to trust a man gasping for breath as he hangs on a cross between common criminals, well, as the Apostle Paul put in his letter to the Corinthians, this is just too big of an obstacle for the Jews to overcome, and for Gentiles it's just sheer foolishness. Which is why the cross is the perfect litmus test. Because nobody, not one of us on our own understands the cross. Nobody, by our own wisdom, by our own strength, would ever choose to take up a cross and follow Jesus. I'm not talking about the cute, shiny crosses that we sometimes hang from our necks, or the crosses that we get tattooed onto our bodies. I'm talking about an execution stake. One Bible commentator calls the cross the most feared symbol in the ancient Roman world. The cross was so much more than a form of execution. See, it was so insane, so torturous, that Roman citizens could not be crucified. Roman lawbreakers could be executed, but not with a cross. Roman citizens deserved the dignity of something like a quick beheading, which is mortifying to us, right? That was the dignified path. The cross was reserved for enemies of the empire who needed to suffer and be made a public example. The cross was a witness to all who would see it that the Roman Empire was in control, that Caesar was Lord, and that Caesar could take life from you, one breath at a time. So don't get out of line. Don't cause any trouble. Know who is Lord and who is Master. As Jesus hung from the execution stake, a sign hung over his head. King of the Jews. For the Romans, this is hilarious. What a fall this man has suffered, right? To imagine himself a king of these people, only to be put in his place, to be given a proper throne of such shame. For the Jews, this was utterly disastrous. One more failed revolution. If you look at the history of that time, there were a number of so-called messiahs who rose up and attempted to start movements. Many gained followings, but this one seems to be worse than all the others. Usually a messianic movement at least brings the dead bodies of a few Roman soldiers. This movement was pitiful. It resulted in the betrayal of one of this so-called Messiah's closest friends. It results in a single ear getting chopped off in the garden. You get a naked man running scared through an olive grove. You get this strong fisherman who then fearfully denies following this Messiah in front of a young slave girl. And here, by the end, he hangs, completely abandoned by everyone who had announced him as king just days earlier. All you get are a few women standing off to the side watching, which they could do because women in that culture were no threat to anybody, and so there they were. They just overlooked everyone else gone. The journey that Jesus took to the cross was the most effective church reduction strategy of all time. Before Jesus even had a church to call church, he killed it. It shouldn't surprise us that in the last 10 to 15 years, there have been a number of pastors of large churches across America who realized that they had built large churches around entertaining crowds or making empty promises or preaching a false or partly true Messiah. Listen to these pastors tell their stories, and what you will hear is a consistent theme. At some point, they began to change their methods. They began to preach Christ crucified, calling people to be disciples of Jesus, calling them to take up crosses and follow Jesus. And each of these pastors tells the exact same story, that at the moment when they began to change what they had been doing, they saw a mass exodus from the churches that they were serving. It's a miracle. Jesus' church reduction strategy continues to be effective 2,000 years later. The cross really is a litmus test. But if you've ever used an actual litmus test, you know that to look at the little deal and the colors, you have to have some sort of key to understand what you're looking at, to make sense of it, to know what the results mean. The challenge for us, for Christians in our culture, is that we've assumed that our culture is more Christian than it is. We've superficially assumed that anyone around us who uses the name Jesus, that anyone who thanks God in their acceptance speeches, that a pastor who preaches about Jesus, even mentioning the cross, passes the test, so to speak. But there are a lot of people who are willing to say that Jesus died for them on a cross because they've romanticized the cross and haven't really thought about what it means to say that the God of the universe would subject himself to the brutal torture and death at the hands of feeble humans. There are a lot of people willing to say that Jesus is their Savior. But how many are willing to say that they serve a crucified Lord? That their King is the one who laid down all of his rights and privileges and powers, taking the form of a servant, humbling himself to die a humiliating death at our hands. As I watched the recent Republican primary debate, I was overwhelmed how much like Peter, the candidates all sounded like. Candidate after candidate talked about their personal relationship with Jesus. And if anyone had a close personal relationship with Jesus, it was Peter. Each candidate went on about the reasons that they would be a good president. And each described in their own words the strength that they would show to the world if they were president. They talked about how they would show our enemies who was boss. They talked about how quick they would be to act and to fight and to destroy our enemies when they threaten our way of life. Each candidate then found an opportunity to criticize the current president for being weak, way too weak, because he often seeks nonviolent options first. I can't help but think, I can't imagine any of the candidates running would vote for Jesus if he were running for president. But by listening to them, we have to imagine that they would be right there at the foot of the cross with the leaders, the Jewish leaders, saying, "Get down from there. Do you know what people are going to think if you're up there? The longer you stay up there, the more weak you seem to everyone else." You know, Caesar, he's going to march right into Crimea because he thinks that you're going to let him. You know, Jesus, all of these wars going on in the world, they really are your fault. If you would just be more aggressive and show these people who's boss, man, your kingdom would come and it would be the greatest again. Now, of course, all of this is absurd. Jesus wouldn't run for president of the United States. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but I think Jesus wouldn't run for president of the United States because he would die at the hands of the American church before he ever got a chance to. Now, we don't use crosses anymore. We're far too civilized for that. We'd probably just torture Jesus to death with some combination of Justin Bieber and the Kardashians mixed in with some drones. I really think Jesus would make the church and its leaders so angry that we would kill him again if he showed up here. This is awkward to say, right? Because we're supposed to read this story and go, "Oh, these silly Jews, how did they not know that Jesus was the Messiah? They're so dull. Don't they know anything?" But then if we started thinking about the kinds of things that Jesus might say if he showed up and we're here in our midst, he might start to announce the destruction of every single church building that gets treated as though it were a temple. He might start hanging out with all of the people that the church has been busy excluding and sort of standing against for decades. He would definitely stand up and tell us that we need to stop clinging to our rights. He might tell us to stop stockpiling our guns. He might tell us to stop padding our bank accounts. He might insult us the way that he insults the Pharisees and the other religious leaders for having zero self-control or the ability to delay gratification. He might tell us that we need to stop idolizing democracy and America. He might tell us that we need to stop trusting a military to protect us. He might tell us to apologize to everyone that we've stolen from. He might warn us about those who devoured the houses and the lands of the people who owned the land before us, while doing it all in the name of Jesus. He might warn us about those who have grown richer and richer on the backs of the poor. The church in America would get so sick of Jesus and all of his shenanigans that we would have no choice but to trump up false charges against him, charges of treason and being unpatriotic, and we would shout for his execution. If you don't believe that you would do this, or if you don't believe that you at least have the potential to do this, read and reread Mark over and over again and ask yourself, what do I make of the cross? Is the cross the path that I am ready to walk with Jesus? Can I accept a king who refuses to flex his muscles and instead dies? Even when to us that doesn't seem like the most effective way possible, and we know that in the time between when Jesus could have just cleaned up the earth and instead disappeared and left us to do this business, and when he returns, that He could have fixed everything, and lots of suffering could have been ended if Jesus just sort of set everything right 2,000 years ago. What is he doing? This doesn't make any sense. As we read Mark, we find Jesus telling Peter, I'm heading for a cross. That is my path. And Peter tries to stop him, because that's what Peter does. He rebukes Jesus as though Jesus has like a demon in him or something. Followers of Jesus who do not have the eyes to see clearly always stand in the way of the cross. Because without eyes to see, the cross always looks like weakness. Without eyes to see, the cross always looks like shame, and it always looks foolishness. Looks foolish. When Peter says to Jesus, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. What Peter actually meant there was, I will die in battle beside you. I believe that you are the king, and I will fight with you to the death for the sake of the kingdom that you are bringing. This is a kind of sacrifice. It is the kind of sacrifice that America celebrates. We honor those who are willing to risk their lives for our sakes. This is noble. Especially as we look around and we notice that there aren't that many who are willing to sign up for that task. But we have to be honest. We cannot be deceived. Christian sacrifice, taking up a cross, laying down your life for others, is not the same thing as losing your life while fighting in battle. Fighting in battle is exactly what Peter was willing to do. He was willing to die, but only if in the process on the way he could take down some Romans. In fact, best case scenario for somebody who goes into battle fighting is survival, right? Nobody goes in like, hey, I'm going to get killed right away. No, survival is what we're going for. But Peter is committed to the larger cause, and he's willing to offer his life if he should die, but hopefully he comes out alive. Mark's gospel paints the ridiculous picture of Peter and his disciples attempting to stand and fight. In chapter 14, verse 45, we read where Judas has come to the garden, and Judas comes up to Jesus, and at once he says, Rabbi, and he kisses him. And then the crowd with swords and clubs, they lay hands on Jesus and they seize him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. So, these chapters are dense and they are heavy and they are serious. And yet, I want to suggest to you that they're filled with humor. Go with me here. How does one cut off an ear? By missing the head, right? We don't know if he swung or if he stabbed. All we know is that he missed. Who goes for the ear? I mean, can you imagine the scene? I can easily remember back to high school all the times where someone who is not a fighter was going to pick a fight. They walked up to somebody else ready to fight. They looked so seriously. They looked like they knew what they were doing. But the moment the fight broke out, it was just hilarious. I remember one guy who, in a fight, began to make sound effects with every single punch. It was just embarrassing. Or you've seen the guy in the movies, right? Who should not have a gun, but he does. And he has it tucked into his pants somewhere. And he's trying to be tough. And then he tries to intimidate somebody. And he shoots himself in the leg or in the foot. This is the scene that we have here. There's this mob. In a mob, you should be able to take somebody out. You take your sword and you stab them. And you get a body. And so you could say, look, we've started to pile them up. But the disciple misses. And 2 verses later, they've all run away. They've all left Jesus and fled. This is what it looks like when followers of Jesus fight back. We just look silly because this is not who Jesus trained us to be. Jesus didn't choose warriors. He chose mostly fishermen. When some bystanders hear Jesus praying on the cross, they assume that he's calling for help. Because this is what people do when they're faced with death. Help! Rescue me! But the seconds tick away. The timer is running out. And Jesus is not rescued. And he doesn't Hulk out. And he doesn't take himself down from the cross. And when Jesus breathes his last, we're faced with the question of whether we want this kind of Jesus, a crucified Messiah. A Messiah who didn't take himself off the cross. A Messiah who might not take us off the cross if we have followed him and have bore one and have been opposed in the way that he has. And so, what do we do with the cross? There's a sort of awkwardness in the Gospels, right? Where there's a transition between the cross and what comes next. And we'll look at that passage next week. But sometimes it's easy to romanticize the cross. It is the way by which Jesus saves us, but how? It's good for us to think about that this week. And one way to start is by singing. So I'm going to ask the team to come forward. And as we sing together, as we prepare to come to the table, one of the questions that I want you to think about is, we say that the death of Jesus means victory. How? How is this death victorious? Would you stand with me as we sing?